This is the second part of the bonus lecture on Richard Linche's Sonnet 4. In the first part, we explored what it's like to get to know this poem, how you might juggle several different interpretations, closely examining the poem for evidence and counter-evidence, checking everything to see if it fits with what you think is going on. And I suggested that in this poem, the speaker compares his heart to the mighty walled city of Troy, and compares love to an invading army who uses deceitful tactics to breach his defences and throw his life into ruin. I also suggested that there hasn't necessarily been any romantic relationship here. The conquest which he describes is between himself and love. We don't actually know if he's ever even spoken to this woman that he seems to like. Now, let's talk a little bit about the poem's form. First, it's called a sonnet, it looks like a sonnet, count the lines, there are 14 lines, probably a sonnet. Art rhymes with heart, so let's say we write A next to each line. Looks rhymes with books, so we write B. And going through the sonnet like that, we determine the rhyme scheme, and it looks like a Shakespearean sonnet, also known as an English sonnet. Count the syllables in each line, tap it out on your fingers. What sure good terms, what all persuading art. So most lines are 10 or maybe 11 syllables. Why am I not quite sure yet? Well, in early modern English, sometimes the E in a word that ends ed, sometimes it gets pronounced, sometimes it doesn't. So the word might be sugared, 2 syllables, or sugar-red, 3 syllables. And this is a clip from Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, in which you can hear the pronunciation of the word which today we would say as punished.
See what a scourge is laid upon your hate, that heaven finds means to kill your joys with love. And I, for winking at your discords, to have lost a brace of kinsmen. All are punished. All are punished!
As it turns out, since the poem gives us the option of 10 syllables per line, let's read it as regular. So mostly the E's are silent, what sugared terms, what all persuading art. The exception is this word, which needs to be pronounced armoured to get us up to 10 syllables on that line. So next we scan the sonnet to find out where the stresses fall. The stress is kind of like the beat. So take a printout and mark where you think the stresses go. The little curves are unstressed syllables and the slashes are stressed. This is always a little bit subjective. Your sense of what the poem means and where the stresses fall, those two things are linked to each other. But here's where I think they fall for me. And you kind of figure it out by reading it out loud in a slightly exaggerated way. What sugared terms, what all persuading art. What sweet mellifluous words, what wounding looks, love used for his admittance to my heart. Such eloquence was never read in books. He promised pleasure, rest, and endless joy, fruition of the fairest she alive, and so on. Now, there are some lines which I find pretty tricky. You could say them in lots of different ways, but we see that it does mostly fit the meter of iambic pentameter, 10 syllables per line in a pattern of de-dum, 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 de-dum. And in fact, if the sonnet were completely regular, the scansion would only look a little bit different. And most of the differences are at the beginning of the lines, which is actually a very common exception in iambic pentameter. So this is a pretty regular sonnet. Okay, so finally, is there a volta? A volta is a moment in a sonnet where the poem kind of changes direction. It might be posing a problem and then it turns to the solution, or it might have one tone and then switch to another. Occasionally, people will tell you that the volta is this kind of fixed thing that always occurs in the same place in every sonnet, in Petrarchan sonnets between the octave and the sestet, and in Shakespearean before the final couplet. Now, of course, this is ridiculous. It really depends on the poem. In my view, in this sonnet, there isn't a very strong volta. They could argue maybe that there's a volta that occurs between lines 6 and 7, when we turn from love's promises to what love delivers. Or you might want to argue that there's a volta between lines 12 and 13, a turn from the speaker's specific story to the more general terse summary that's applicable to lovers everywhere. So I've rather artificially separated the discussion of content and form into the two parts of this lecture, as though they were separate things. But of course, form and content are not separate, they're woven together. In your passage analysis, sometimes a good approach is to weave your discussion of form in as a way of supporting your argument. One or two of you made this great suggestion: that formally strange line, his pleasure, pain, rest, trouble, joy, annoy, has a difficult to follow syntax and sluggish rhythm, which may suggest the onset of pain, toil, and a sense of paralysis or disempowerment. So we can see how form and content are kind of woven together, intimately interconnected. Or here's another example of how you could weave in a discussion of form. In lines 9 to 12, the woman's attractive features, bright eyes, fair cheeks, etc., are compared to the armoured men concealed in the Trojan horse. The reader is thus confronted with the paradox that what is most visible about the beloved is also hidden and stealthful. In line 10, form performs content, as a line that could potentially be pronounced with up to 12 syllables must be crammed into 10, suggesting the silent soldiers crammed in the horse's belly. So let's just finish by reading the poem and then posing a question. What sugared terms, what all-persuading art, what sweet mellifluous words, what wounding looks love used for his admittance to my heart. Such eloquence was never read in books. He promised pleasure, rest, and endless joy, fruition of the fairest she alive. His pleasure pain, rest trouble, joy annoy have I since found, which me of bliss deprive. The Trojan horse thus have I now let in, wherein enclosed these armoured men were placed. Bright eyes, fair cheeks, sweet lips, and milk-white skin, these foes my life have overthrown and raised. Fair outward shows prove inwardly the worst. Love looketh fair, but lovers are accursed. In a close reading, we are doing analysis. We're not really concerned with evaluating a poem in the sense of praising or disparaging it, saying whether it's good or bad. And the focus should be on the language of the poem itself, not on the poet, not saying whether they're a good or bad poet, or whether they accomplished what they set out to do. That stuff is usually just way too speculative. So stick to the evidence we actually have, which is the words on the page. But that said, we can subtly praise and or be critical of the poem in our analysis. We can kind of tacitly evaluate it. And I don't know if you picked up on it, but I think I've been fairly critical of this poem. So knowing what you now know, which may include your own independent analysis, what is your estimation of this poem? To put it crudely, how good do you think it is? And why?